Okay. So I'm Bernadette Shaheen, West Coast Section Chair, and I wanted to welcome Mike McGinley. He's going to be speaking on perceptions of odor in our world and how we measure community odors. And a couple of things, we are going to mute everybody. We're going to have you save questions to the end. You can put questions in the chat, and we want to encourage everyone to get involved with West Coast Section and to join West Coast Section. And from there, I'm going to have Bhaskar Shandan actually introduce Mike. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bhaskar Shandan. I'm the past chair of the West Coast section. I'll just go through some housekeeping notes. If you can please mute yourself while the seminar or the webinar is going on. And as far as the questions are concerned, at the end of this presentation, you can always unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can type anything in the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box and we'll take the questions as they come in at the end of the session. Mike, we have total 1 hour, so if you can wrap up in maybe 45 minutes, we have ample of time for questions. Just FYI, we will put this presentation on our website. And actually, it's interesting how we came to know about this presentation. So there was an article published in New York Times earlier this year about the odor issues. And as you can see, that's Chuck McGinley on the cover of the New York Times, and Mike was also featured in that article. It's a very nice article. If you get a chance, do read that article. It gives you a lot of information on odor issues and the things that Chuck and Mike are doing in this field, which is really very impressive what they've done so far. And that's when we figured it would be a good opportunity for us to bring them on and have this webinar, this lunchtime webinar. The last time we had something similar to this was back in 2011, and that was a presentation by Jane Curran from UCLA, Dr. Jane Curran. And I'll put this presentation also on the website. Basically, it'll be on the same page where the announcement is, and we'll insert both the presentations here so that you can refer to them. But we are very happy to have Mike come in and do this presentation for us today. Mike is the second generation owner of St. Croix Sensory. He received his Bachelor of Chemical Engineering from University of Minnesota and Masters of Health Science degree in Environmental Health Engineering from Johns Hopkins. Since 1997, Mike has directed product and material testing at St. Croix Sensory. His leadership in the field of odor assessment, including contribution to ASTM standards and industry publications, has earned him international recognition in this advancement of science of sensory. So we are really happy to have him. We are glad to make him come to our section and make this presentation for us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mike. Let me give you the presenter. You can take it out from there.
Perfect. I think we can do, yeah, let's do window. Let's see if we can make this work. Looks right. And I gotta start there. That look good?
Yep, looks good.
Looks like that's working out. So thank you everybody for taking the time today to listen. Feel free to type. I'll kind of keep an eye on the chat section. So if you have a quick, simple question, if I catch it and can refer to it as I'm talking, I'll do that, or we'll take a peek at them at the end. Just to kind of give some background, St. Croix Sensory, my father and mother started the business in 1980. My father was doing odor control consulting and started doing odor testing with an olfactometer in 1981. this here is a picture showing our odor lab here in Stillwater, Minnesota. Whoops, I'm kind of getting a feedback there from somebody. In Minnesota, in the eastern suburb of the Twin Cities, and we're operating, doing environmental odor testing almost on a daily basis. Over the years, this is just kind of talking about odor through the years. Looks like I stole this slide from one of my Canadian presentations, so there's a U in odor. This obviously, different industries have been involved in different decades here, but really when we look back, you know, it's 1960s and rendering where some of the first things were happening in work to quantify odors, which some of that was parallel to a lot of work that was happening in food science and sensory work at that time as well. Different industries have kind of played key roles in different times over the past. So a picture in the upper right there, that's my father running an old olfactometer in the early 80s. I know there was a time one of those olfactometers was being run at the district that includes San Francisco, where they would do odor testing, following up on complaints and so forth. And over the years, we've had all these different industries, and obviously, I know you've seen in California as well that cannabis is the hot button issue of odor today. Of course, all those other industries are hot buttons in certain communities, but overall, there's no doubt. I mean, we get calls weekly, multiple calls weekly regarding cannabis odors, whether that's from communities or facilities or agencies, so forth. So we also do testing of products, and that's been a big area of my focus. So we do all kinds of testing. That is a real picture of assessment of deodorant in the upper left there. It still is, I mean, people always think, oh, instrumentation and whatnot, but still the best method of assessment is people sniffing things and doing ratings and scorings in the best way we can in use of people. This is just another quick example showing some chambers in our lab where we do different, you know, types of testing setups of air fresheners or air cleaners or other things like that. So our company, we really are focused on the laboratory side of things. We aren't doing as much consulting where we're fixing odor problems or whatnot. Usually engineering firms that are working for facilities are coming to us for the odor measurement, just like they go to an analytical laboratory for different chemistry analysis. We also do some things in the realm of food and beverage. And then we've kind of done some fun things in adding what we've learned about smell to art and theatrical performances and things, which is kind of a fun side of things we do. Overall, odor, very primitive sense of smell that where our bodies are using our perception to kind of scan what's around us, consider if there's dangers, consider if we want to leave the area. But there's also that element of just, you know, pleasure of smells, what's attracting us to certain things. You know, it's just a very key part of our lives. And I think we've seen in COVID, it's been a topic of a conversation as people lost their sense of smell. And when there was so many people losing it, it kind of heightened interest in conversation about sense of smell. And I think there's kind of been a bump in research in that area to see, kind of understand that and understand, you know, how people could get their sense of smell to return after that time. A little bit on anatomy very quickly, this showing cross-section of the head, the nerves hanging out in the back of the nose, and they're the only nerves in the body that are directly exposed to the environment and connected to our brain through the olfactory bulb. You actually have two olfactory bulbs, one above each nostril, the nerves receiving signals and sending that information up into the brain. If you sit, as you're sitting there right now, if you just take a couple comfortable breaths through your nose, so mouth closed, and just take some comfortable breaths. If you just take comfortable breaths through your nose, you'll find you feel it cooling right along the upper palate of your mouth. The most of the air is just really traveling right over the top of your mouth as it goes down into our lungs as we're breathing. A little bit goes up, sneaks its way up over our nerves. And it's why as we're walking around through our day, we might notice something and sniff. We stop and sniff. And when you stop and sniff, if you do that same thing again, but now take some sniffs, if I take sniffs, you feel that cooling sensation go higher up in your nose. So that act of sniffing is pulling more volume, faster rate, kind of pushes it up over the nerves. So it changes. It's a different kind of function in that perception. When we do smell something, that signal goes two directions. We see smells that trigger memories, that everybody has probably had experiences where involuntarily you can walk into a building and immediately you think of, maybe this smells like my elementary school, or this smells like my dorm, or this smells like a place I used to work. Can sometimes happen without you're needing to think about that. It just kind of slaps you in the face, says, holy cow, this reminds me of this. And those strong memories influenced by smell that are, really happening without us having to work hard at it. But then there's other things related to emotion, hormones, and immune system that can be triggered. It's why there's a full industry of essential oils that are trying to also influence positively through sense of smell, things that are, our mood and immune system through functions in the brain. The other signal is into the frontal cortex, where we think about a smell. So it's as I smell something, I think about, do I like how it smells in here? Do I like this perfume? Should I eat this food? And that experience, I have a couple pictures to kind of trigger that of, this example was a moving photo I had found, back in Gulf War time, that has just always kind of impacted me to think about, what that would be like. I was military, but to think about what that would be like to open a letter and be trying to get that little whiff of home, you could imagine how it could just carry a person there. On the conscious side, sniffing the milk is, can I still drink this, or does it need to be dumped out? If I jump back real quick, the other sense that we have is the trigeminal nerves through the nose and our throat, and those are feelings we get. So if I get a sniff of ammonia and it burns my nose, that's a trigeminal sensation. Cooling of menthol, other hot pepper sensations is all trigeminal feelings in the nose, as opposed to perceptions of smell. So our olfactory sense is really a significant part of our body. I think it's maybe taken for granted as we use communication and our eyesight so significantly. But yet, if you look at it primitively, it's been identified that there's at least 1,000 genes that play some role in the function of our sense of smell. Yet eyesight, there's been 3 genes identified to have a role in eyesight. So there's a significant difference. And if you think about other animals, how significant and important sense of smell can be. Regarding community, it's hard to do anything in odor without coming across this acronym, which started out as phyto, and these different elements I'll step through, and then it's kind of been taken a little bit further, I think, rightfully. So if we kind of step through these elements a little bit out of order, citizens sitting at home, the first thing that becomes important is how strong the smell is that they experience. Obviously, the stronger the smell is, the more likely they are to quickly complain. But it's that perception of strength in that experience. Offensiveness is considering, what does it smell like? What's its character? How good or bad it is. So you can think about the scenario and say, it could be strong smelling, but it smells like a bakery. A person is less likely to complain versus a weaker odor of dead animal, is much more quickly that somebody is going to be offended and bothered by it. but time becomes a factor as well. So even that example of a bakery and a bakery, strong odor that you can think about, well, that's pleasant. Nobody's going to be bothered. But if that was every single morning or even afternoon sometimes, right? So if you're getting a long experience of that bakery odor, even a pleasant odor can start to become a bother. And there's, I think, many examples of food production companies around the country where, that long term, whether it's high frequency or long duration, that it's enough that even though it might be considered a more pleasant smell, it still becomes a bother and a nuisance to people. So those pieces all become very important. Finally, this element of the receptor was added. And I first heard this being talked about in Canada, where they started to talk about the context of the smell, that the situation surrounding it also matters, which is 100% correct. Others started to call this location. Now, most people are referring this now as to receptor factors. Whether it's near a school and involves children, people might be more quick to be bothered, concerned, complaining, or simple politics, or what's going on in a community. If everybody knows a certain facility is starting to cause a problem, then they become quicker to complain, just because of the context of the situation that's going on. So all of those elements come together. As I said, it's pretty hard to do anything in odor without that concept being discussed. It is a concept that some state agencies, as they evaluate nuisance odor, that's usually an element of how they're considering the situation. Whether a facility needs to be kind of called into check or not, kind of depends on some of those factors. We've seen, I don't have a slide here, but I've seen there's a kind of a monograph of a way to look at odors in the state of Texas that breaks that down and looking at frequency and intensity, and then breaking apart what type of smell it is and how strong it is, and whether or not it would be considered nuisance. So our expertise is in measuring odors. We help, as I've said before, companies, agencies, and citizen groups when they've called upon us to help look at how they're measuring smells. Facilities can be looking at it, trying to find the root cause of the problems. We see a lot of times when a facility actually does start an odor monitoring program, they can have a lot of success early, because when they're out actually actively seeking and actively thinking about, why do we smell it here? Why has the odor traveled? Or what's the character? So where's it coming from? A lot of times you can find simple things like housekeeping issues or doors that are being, held open that were meant to be closed. A lot of times there's a short list of simple things that help a facility make progress right away when they're able to really kind of drill down into the why the odors are present. But sometimes that takes a different line of thinking. If a facility is intending to get out there to document they don't have smells, we always push very hard that they're keeping an open mind and thinking through when they do find them to really put the effort in to track that back. So ongoing, we work with facilities that have been doing monitoring for, many, many years. And then they're looking at, over time, are they seeing improvement? Are they seeing character changes because they've reduced sources? And I'll say, we were talking a little bit before everybody jumped in, Orange County Sanitation was doing some work like that, and that Mel Suffett was involved in, where they were putting a lot of focus to the character of the smell to really try to drill down to, which sources were causing, the complaints in the communities near treatment plants, the key treatment plants. So something we always come across that's yes, it's true, but there's some different ways of looking at this. But you often hear people say, well, odors are subjective. What are we going to do about it anyway? The subjective nature of odor is truly how people feel about it, their opinion of the smell. And yes, that can vary between people. we always like to give an example of, we had two sisters come through training, and on one day a sister talked about how one of her favorite smells was horse manure, and she laughed and said, everybody always thinks I'm weird, but I grew up on a horse farm. I love being around the horses, so I smell manure and it just takes me back. Well, her sister came in a couple days later and was talking about how she hates horse manure because she grew up on a horse farm. It was always cleaning the stalls and so forth. So it was like, here you have these two sisters, grew up same conditions, but obviously a different experience, and then have a different opinion of the smell. You do have differences in sensitivity, but what we try to do with our team of assessors through training, you're trying to become and create data that's as objective as you possibly can using a group of people. And it's exactly what companies like Coca-Cola and General Mills are trying to do, as they're using people to analyze, evaluate products that they're creating, and try to understand the perception of those products and improve them to be more liked, more appreciated, whatever it might be that they're striving for. And so it's using those same concepts that are used in the food industry to look at how can we evaluate smells and understand them, and do that in as objective a way as we possibly can. So in the samples we're evaluating, we look at odors from a few different perspectives that I'll really quickly brush over. A lot of this I'm brushing through is stuff I do in a day, sometimes day and a half of training. But we look at odor threshold values, and that's not the chemical concentration, but initially we look at olfactometry and dilutions of smell perception, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But then we also look at characterization. What does it smell like? How strong is it? The odor intensity. And then often, this is a big thing of what Mel Suffolk's group at UCLA looks at, is persistency of the smell. As that odor is being diluted, how does it change as it blows downwind, and thus might be affecting the community in different ways. It's why sometimes you get facilities say, well, they're complaining of that odor. That's not what we smell like. Well, sometimes it is. It's something that's hiding underneath other odors, but as it dilutes and blows downwind, maybe that base note remains and now smells a little different than the facility typically does. And that often, is a part of complications or confusions when people are trying to find out, the source of smells. But odor is a perception. So odor is the experience of a person or animal. It's the perception of the nerves in our nose and our brain to interpret them. And all of that is coming from odorants that are floating around in the air. And so these odorants are floating around, and they become odors when they go into our nose. And we need to evaluate and understand that perception side. And that's often done parallel to doing chemical analysis. Sometimes it's more simple, where we look at simple single compounds. Even if they're complicated compounds, it still may be a single compound. But much more often, we're dealing with complex mixtures, even from a facility, whether it's a landfill, wastewater treatment plant. You've got hundreds of compounds, and it's trying to understand which elements are, or which sources are those that are leading to issues in the community. We often come across where people put a lot of attention to the chemical odor thresholds for compounds. But the challenge there is, and I always give the example of ammonia. If you go to a literature and look for the value for the odor threshold of ammonia, you'll find results of everywhere from 40 parts per billion to 40 parts per million. And when I look at that range, I say that's useless. It could be anything. And that range is enormous. In reality, in the laboratory, we find ammonia is more around like 2 to 4 parts per million, which is actually pretty high for something to be in the part per million range. And when you actually smell or feel a burn of ammonia, you're in quite a few part per million, before you're actually getting that sensation. But you get these wide ranges of chemical concentrations representing odor thresholds, which makes it quite challenging to make really good determinations or guesses as to what will be that experience. You couple that with complex mixtures, And now it's a question of what happens when you have all these odorants at different concentrations that might be above or below their threshold value, and how do they sort of add up? Because you can't add them up. So what ways can you look at them that can give reference? So when we look at odor threshold data, I think that these here are the most important things we point out to people to consider the age of the data that you're looking at. It's easy to talk about the sensory side of things, but if a number was determined back in the 60s or 70s, how good might have been the analytical analysis at that time, and so how accurate might be the value, but compared to also the issue of how was the odor assessment made? Is it anecdotal? Was it done with chambers? That sort of thing becomes important. So if you do kind of push in looking at data and look at data from the last 30 years or so, you definitely start to see a narrower band of concentrations, a little more agreement in results. And just leading into COVID, we haven't done too much of this in the last couple of years, but just before COVID, we had quite a few projects that involved chemical companies coming to us and saying we need to determine definitively what is the odor threshold of these three compounds, because whether it was for health and safety reasons or whether it was for understanding environmental implications, they came to us and said, yeah, we know it's in literature, it's these types of values, we need a study that's going to give us confidence of what it really is. And so we've done multiple studies like that in the past using a larger pool of assessors to determine what is a more definitive threshold. Now that threshold result becomes the threshold under controlled conditions in a laboratory. Translating that to real world, obviously people probably would take a little bit higher concentration to detect because of the things that are around us in a given day that might distract us or interfere. So while the odor threshold for hydrogen sulfide in the lab has been found to be half a part per billion, it's probably several part per billion before somebody'd actually stand in their front yard and say, I smell hydrogen sulfide, because of all the other smells that are around us on a given day. So we're trying to understand in the work that we do how odor flows downwind. The source is kind of being a simple case of a point source, and how that point source odor releases and disperses as it blows downwind, and trying to understand the odor and understand that process. And that's typically done with olfactometry. And I showed this photo earlier where this is an olfactometer from the 80s, and the ASTM methodology that was commonly used then and still used today with modifications with time. This is an olfactometer we're routinely using in our lab, and there's also a European testing methodology of olfactometry that's really parallel reference to this olfactometry work. So in this photo, you see the test administrator on the right and the assessor on the left. On our particular olfactometer, an assessor comes up one at a time and makes their observations, and they take turns sniffing and making those observations. What happens at the olfactometer is we use the ASTM methodology is a triangular forced choice approach. It's a difference test. It's the Sesame Street, which of these is not like the other. And so we start presenting the smell to the assessor at very high dilution. I use that as a relative term. So at a very high dilution to where it's below threshold. So as the assessor sniffs, there's two of these circles are blank, and one of them has the diluted odor in it. And if we do our work correctly, we start the assessors where they sniff all three, or in this visual analogy, you look at all three and you can't tell which one's different. They all just seem the same. And early on, the forced choice methodology is that we don't want assessors to just phone it in. We want them to try hard, and they're forced to pick one. And early on, yeah, they know what they're doing, and they sniff all three and try to find it. And they just ultimately say, I have to guess. I have no idea which one it is. I'm going to guess number 2. And we record that data. I've flipped now to the next level on the olfactometer. And now the odor is in one of these 3 circles. It may have moved circles, kind of like a shell game. And it's now twice as strong as it was on the previous presentation. And so now the assessor sniffs the 3 circles, or you look at the 3 circles and you think about, can I tell which one's different? Somebody with really good eyesight, or maybe was really paying attention, maybe you're sitting there going, I think it's one of those. And you can kind of think of that like your sensitivity to smell. And so an assessor who's in training might start to say, well, maybe it's that one. And we take them through and building their confidence. Right now, I'm just going to say, I still don't know, so I'm going to guess the 3rd one on the right. And so, okay, we record that answer. Now we take the assessor to the next level. Now the odor's twice as strong. We may have moved it. We may have left it in the same place. That's part of the randomization and the methodology. Now most of you probably can look at those 3 and identify one's different. And early on, when assessors are sniffing, they find one different. Maybe they can't really describe what's different about it, but they're starting to say, yeah, the middle one's definitely different. And that point is considered a detection threshold. I'm finding the point where the odor is becoming different. And now we go one level higher, where the odor is even stronger. And now it becomes even easier. Oh, for sure, it's the first one. And now as the odor is getting stronger, maybe now somebody says, oh, that's gross. Or maybe somebody says, that's hydrogen sulfide. Or somebody says, oh, that smells like garlic. But as you're starting to be able to make a comment about how it smells, whether it's good or bad, or what it smells like, that's now where the odor's hitting recognition threshold. So that's a bit of a difference there when we're looking at odor thresholds, of detection being the point where you can just tell there's a difference in the air, and recognition the point where you can tell there's a difference in the air and you can just start to say what that difference is. And again, we can proceed where we're confirming to make sure the assessors are doing a good job, and here now the odor is very strong, and so forth. So what this does now is we've determined in that olfactometry, through presenting dilutions to these assessors, we can determine essentially how much dilution was needed to bring that odor to the threshold point. Okay, whether it's a recognition threshold or detection threshold. And so in this visual representation, that odor's leaving the source, it blows downwind. After a certain amount of dilution, you now cannot recognize it anymore. And if it dilutes a little bit more, it now goes away completely. In reverse, you could talk about being the person on the left, and if they started walking towards the facility, they don't smell anything, and all of a sudden they hit a point where, oh, I think I start to notice something in the air. And if they go a little bit further, oh, there's for sure something in the air, and I can tell what it is, or I can describe it. So these are those different threshold points. And the olfactometry is trying to help us understand where those are. And we do that through air dispersion modeling. And so through the air dispersion modeling, we can predict where in the community those threshold points would be. So odor assessment and that number of dilutions that the olfactometry predicts is often given the pseudo dimensions of odor units per meter cubed. Basically, every meter cubed of air of that sample needs to be diluted 5,000 times to bring it down to the threshold point. And with that pseudo dimensions, you get an emission rate. So we can end up getting that in odor units per second, put that into a model like we would grams per second, and then we can predict where downwind would be the point of one odor unit, and one odor unit being that detection threshold point. Where would it just be observed? And of course, all of this is prediction, lots of statistics, lots of studies of perception and so forth, but very, very helpful, especially if you're trying to start to understand what would happen if we put odor control on this source. And now instead of 5,000, the output would be 500. And how would that change the prediction of what would happen downwind, depending on the quality of weather data, quality of the model, and all those elements. Because, as just showing, again here graphically, if that person's standing there, now they're standing at a spot that it's 3 odor units, so they can smell it, but it's pretty weak. And if they keep getting closer, the odor units are going higher and higher until they were standing at the source where it was 5,000. So I hope that kind of helps. That's like the olfactometry, in coffee talk, of very, very quick understanding of how that's being used. In Europe and in Ontario, Canada, and Australia, and actually many parts of the world, this is how odors are very, very commonly regulated, or at least made part of permitting processes, where facilities are required to measure the odors from their sources, run dispersion modeling to get an understanding of the impact into the community. And so in Europe, it's very common then to look at, where are different points. For example, they may say, any receptor should not have exceedances of, 3 odor units more than 1% of the time in a given year based on modeling results. Or they might say, based on 10% of the time. So they look at odor results, modeling results, and percentile of exceedances, and as a way to understand and consider whether a facility would be creating a nuisance. And as I said, obviously then it's also used to look at odor control and how odor control would change the situation to improve, hopefully, the situation. And I also have to talk about field olfactometry. That was if you go back and recall the picture we saw at the beginning of this presentation of my father in the photo with the New York Times with our nasal ranger field olfactometer. But a field olfactometer is doing dilution just like in the laboratory, but it's doing that in a handheld device. And so it's really in being able to monitor that perception out in the community. And so this is the centometer, which was developed in the late 50s. And really, if you remember one of my first slides, it was really around rendering. And as groups were looking at how do we quantify these smells from rendering stockyards and those sort of sources at that time that were key. So this device right here in this photo is from the late 50s. The 2 glass ports on your left very uncomfortably go into each nostril, and you sniff. You can kind of almost imagine it sort of like a musical instrument. You're putting those in each nostril and you're taking a sniff. The majority of air goes through the top and bottom of the device, and if you see the black kind of strips to the top and bottom, those are carbon beds. And so the majority of air is going through the top and bottom and through the carbon into that middle mixing chamber. And then at the far end, I hope you can see the circles, the holes in the device at the far end, which are then going to let the air in that you're standing in and go into the mixing device to create those different dilutions. And so often you either use your fingers to play it like a flute, or strips of tape were very common to open up the different orifices to the different dilution levels. So again, if we kind of flip back this picture, maybe that helps make a little more sense that you've got the carbon filtered air coming from the top and bottom. The odorous air that we're standing in is coming in from the right, and it goes into the sniffing port at different dilution amounts. We then developed the Nasal Ranger. Amazingly, it was 20 years ago, but the Nasal Ranger still is very common use, and really is the same concept as the centometer, where you can see the circles on the side of the device are like a respirator cartridges. So there's one on each side. You see that kind of flower, pattern circle is like a respirator cartridge. And so as you sniff through the nasal ranger, the majority of air is going through that carbon cartridge to become odor free. And at the front of the device, little hard to see in the photo, but there's different orifices on the front of the device that give us different dilutions. And so there's a small orifice at the 60 position. So that little bit of air that's getting through that small orifice is leading to diluting the air we're standing in 60 times. And if you come around the dial to position to the 2, it's a large orifice because it's letting in much more odor, and we're only diluting the air we're standing in twice to what, for us to take a sniff. So now as I'm standing out in the community, we could stand in the community with the nasal ranger where we're above recognition threshold, and we run through the nasal ranger and we find we just start to detect the odor when we get to the 2 position. If we were closer, we might detect the odor at the 15 position. The odor's stronger. It took 15 dilutions to make it go away. So kind of two examples, instances, and these values really do link with the odor unit values. So you can link with that modeling data to take the nasal ranger out and identify, well, the modeling's predicting what we might expect to happen in the community. The nasal ranger allows you to go out and actually measure. The nasal ranger is being used in 10 states as a regulatory tool. Colorado is a very good example because they've had an active regulation that they use the nasal ranger to document the level of odor and if a facility is violating their nuisance. More recently, we're seeing activity more at the municipality level. I think we're hearing some of those conversations in California as odor isn't strictly enforced at the state level, but we've had more conversations with counties and municipalities who are trying to deal with sort of the uprise in cannabis odors and how they can monitor and put some form of regulation on those from a city ordinance standpoint or county ordinance standpoint. The one thing that's very common is a community can't force a facility to measure their sources. And so a common scenario that happens that we see is the lawyers or the citizen group go out and do monitoring. They show with the nasal ranger that they're detecting high levels of odor, and hopefully that then influence whether it's the state or whether it's through the lawyers, they're able to get that facility to open their fence, take some measurements, and give data back. So if they can go out, now they can measure the source and do modeling. They can then understand how that modeling is going to impact the community. So this graphic just trying to highlight the circular nature of that both are different types of measurement, whether it's the laboratory measurement or the field measurement, but they go hand in hand and sometimes get used in different ways, depending on the situation or who is able to do the measurement work. As I said in the beginning, threshold's only part of the story, and this is a big area that Dr. Suffit preaches, and I don't disagree, that you can do all you want about threshold, but there's still this question of what does it smell like and how strong is it? It's just another part of the story and another way of looking at understanding odors. So this is an odor wheel we developed. You might have saw some of those quick slides earlier that Dr. Suffit has developed at UCLA several odor wheels. He has a compost odor wheel, a municipal, or like a urban odor wheel that's kind of general odors, landfill, wastewater treatment. So he's put together different wheels. We've created this wheel as a generic kind of for all types of odors a person experiences. We developed this about 4 or 5 years ago now, and it's really held up very well that we really haven't even had a big desire or need to change it. That you can group odors. It's very common for us to look at odors at the second level of this wheel. So if you look at 1 o'clock, the dark blue is naturally offensive odors. And the second level is sulfur type odors and decay type odors. And a lot of times just being able to break it apart into those types of odors is enough. You know, you don't necessarily really need to pick apart whether it's, would we call this fecal or would we call this sewer? It's sulfury, it's poo. That's often enough. In some of the product testing we do, sometimes you come to a point where you say calling an odor a chemical odor isn't helpful enough. And so sometimes we work with some of our product clients that we're digging deeper into the word chemical and how do we break that into other words and train our panel to understand how we could break that apart. But this has been a helpful odor wheel. Now, when we go to a waste treatment plant or a landfill or any other type of industry and talk about training them to monitor odors, we always say, take this wheel, but now modify it to what's important to your facility. And there's an example that a wastewater treatment plant may quickly say, you know what, that sulfur category, it kind of would be helpful for us to break it apart. You know, we do understand what the difference between fecal and manure character. And so they may choose to add words or get into detail in some of the categories because it is important to them. So this is a tool that's, you know, very helpful as a general wheel and helps industries kind of take the next step to make it custom for them. So then, you know, this is kind of summarizing here the same graphic I've kind of gone back to. Persons out in the community, you can imagine them kind of moving along this line, or depending on how the wind was blowing, does the odor come to them? But as they're somewhere on this gradient, these are the different experiences, that there's these different odor threshold values that obviously as the person gets closer to the source, the odor intensity goes up and the intensity is rated in a different way. I'll say something very, very quickly about health effects because I'm kind of at the last slides and I want to give us some minutes for questions. This is referring to a conference that was convened in 1998, and this was related to animal agriculture. And Dr. Schiffman at Duke University brought together an amazing group of people that it was one of those where I was not worthy to be there, and I was so grateful to be invited by Dr. Schiffman. There were some really amazing researchers, and you know, we were talking about health effects. It's very, very challenging and darn near impossible to truly say whether odors are causing somebody harm. You know, it typically can only be done if you know the odorant, the toxic compound can cause harm. For example, if hydrogen sulfide was at several parts per million, you could easily start to document that there's harm. But when you're talking about parts per billion and different compounds, it's very, very challenging to be able to do that. This monograph that was written that was sort of the synopsis of that is they did conclude that yes, if odors lead to headaches, no matter how, that's a health effect, and it just becomes a question of whether that's something that, in the legal sense of the word, things are going to happen. But they were really pushing that odors have to be considered and investigated from a health standpoint, even though it would be quite challenging to be able to actually definitively make statements about, again, the perceived odor causing harm, different from whether the odorant was causing harm. I put this up to just spread the word. I honestly kind of got busy with other things. I got about halfway through this book, but I found this book very interesting, where this author is talking about smells and how smells are symptoms in communities, and a bit about social justice and where do smells exist in our communities. And so I just like to promote this for the only reason that I think it's a very interesting topic. I don't even know the author, but I really found it to be an interesting and intriguing book. I think I want to stop there. I just kind of had a couple slides about chemical analysis, but I think I'd rather take your questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. That was a great presentation. If anybody wants to ask a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question. We see a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me go through those.
Yeah, I see. So somebody asked, how do previous exposure to certain odors from childhood change their scoring level? That really goes to the point of hedonic tone, and somebody's experiences could drastically have somebody have a different opinion of smells. Assuming they haven't had any damage done to their sense of smell, the point is that we are trying to bring in people. We test them to standard odorants, so we look for them to fall within a certain range of sensitivity. So to some extent, we're standardizing the noses we're looking for. But then through training, you teach them to use intensity scales that hopefully they're able to do without bias. And that's sometimes where somebody fails to be an assessor, that if they can't minimize those biases or they can't be repeatable in their scorings, that's sometimes where they're dismissed or they don't qualify as an assessor. But it's definitely more of a part that affects how we feel about smells. The second question on there was, I don't see cannabin on the wheel. Right, sniffing cannabis smells. If I flip back quick, if you can still see the slide, when we've been doing things with cannabis, it falls into different areas on this wheel, right? It is possible, and I'm not somebody who grew up, I was never really around cannabis. It just wasn't part of my youth. And I've been experiencing it much more in my career now, all of a sudden. And now I go about my daily life and I can pick out cars on the highway that I'm driving by, and they, I can smell it, and it's very distinct. And you could have the word cannabis on here that people could point to. When we've done work, you kind of find cannabis. Sometimes it smells fruity. Sometimes it smells pine, woody. It's the different terpenes. Sometimes it's herbal. Sometimes it's spicy. So technically, when you look at the different terpenes, and we've done this work for a company, when you look at each individual terpene, they tend to fall into those different groupings like herbal, spice, woody, or fruity. And then when you're talking about cannabis, you tend to have a mixture of that. And of course, there's also the skunk character, the sulfur components that go with that. What type of ODT, odor, I think that could be, I could look at that different ways, because some people talk about ODT as offensiveness detection thresholds. In Ontario, they try to look more at that. One of the challenges is in the laboratory, if you're asking your assessors to give an offensiveness rating, their opinion, there's a question of whether that will match the community. And it's always something to be cautious about, because it's hard to go back to a community and say, well, the lab shows this should be below the offensiveness threshold. And it's like, because perception's reality. And if those citizens are saying, I'm offended, I'm annoyed, they are. And how do we define it? And how do we understand? Obviously, when you start to say, is it one person or the community at large, there's other greater conversations there. But in Colorado and other states using the nasal ranger, they've set limits with a 7. And if I put you in a 7 right now, you'd say, oh, that's not very bad. That's not so bad. But if I said, okay, but that's on your deck every day or every evening. Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess that would bother me. And that's that FIDO concept, that limit isn't necessarily something that somebody go, oh yeah, that's a bother. But with frequency and duration, it would be. In modeling, it's more typically you see values of 3, 5, 7, kind of depending on sources and depending on, whether the community is more industrial or not. How do we relate nasal ranger results in the field back to the source odor level for modeling all operations? It's very challenging to do that. To do the back modeling is a very challenging thing. We've seen people attempt it, where if you get enough nasal ranger data where you can say, okay, in this part of the community, we're measuring 7s or 30s, you can kind of trial and error into the model to see, what value predicts that. But that can be pretty tough work. So I don't know if that answered exactly what they were looking for. It's more typical that your nasal ranger work is trying to maybe create the teeth that will force the facility then to actually take measures and analyze their sources and do that modeling of the sources. Can you give an example of a rule or regulation have adopted or are enforcing? So in Colorado, the limit of a 7 is that if they're getting complaints, so it starts with complaints, and so if the whether that's the city or the state, city of Denver has that regulation, the state has a regulation, and some counties do. So if they're getting complaints, they might send out an inspector to the complaining person's house or somewhere nearby, and they typically would go out there with a nasal ranger for an hour, and they would take readings every 10 minutes. And if they get 2 readings that are 7 or higher, and those 2 readings are more than 15 minutes apart, then there's a violation. And so if you think about that, I said that quick, but again, they take a reading every 10 minutes for an hour, so they're staying there for a period. They're not just showing up and getting a reading and leaving. But it is an hour. Now, they could stay longer if they wanted, or if they wanted to come back multiple times. But then they look for that it's over a 7. While they were taking readings every 10 minutes, it has to be more than 15 minutes apart. So that means they got a 7 more than just twice in a row, that there was some level of duration to the odor being present. And so that's where Colorado's kind of built in those elements, based in starting with the complaints. And we've seen other municipalities adopting that same type of principle. And again, in my view, you're not trying to do that to find the facility, but you're trying to do that to get the facility to be forced to sit down and start talking about solutions, whether that's cannabis or whether that's other sources. Because Colorado, they've over the years they've had some issues with brewing or pig farms and other things over the years. So. And then I think the other example I know, like in New Jersey, we've seen where a permit requires odor measurement and modeling. And then that typically just states that, when you do that modeling, you show the odors don't exceed 3 odor units so much of the time, as I was describing the European kind of concept of looking at odors. Odors model is a function of distance. Does it include photochemistry of the volatiles? That's a question for modeling. I mean, I think my answer to that question is it depends on the quality of the model. Does the model take that into account? And that's going to be really hard to do when you're talking about odor units, because you're just modeling how the odor units are being dispersed downwind. So yes, if anything's being modified of the compounds, you might get some variability in that result. But that's part of where you take that model and then try to understand, are you able to validate that by doing some other community inspections? It doesn't have to be nasal ranger. It could be just driving around and getting out and taking sniffs to see if the modeling makes sense from past complaints or from those kind of monitoring experiences. I think that was all the questions that are in chat.
Yeah, that's all. That's all I see in the chat. If anybody else has any questions, you're almost at 1 o'clock. So if you want, we can take one more question. Otherwise, no. All right. I guess that's it as far as the questions are concerned. Mike, again, really, really appreciate this presentation. This was excellent presentation. It gives us different things to think about, as far as regulators are also concerned, as how to use these kind of measurements of odors and into permitting or compliance side. But really appreciate you coming here and giving us the presentation.
Always happy to do it. We know what we do is a little odd, and it's a big part of what we try to do is to educate and spread the word and help people get an understanding of it. So feel free to reach out anytime, anybody.
Absolutely. We'll do that. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for coming, and really appreciate you. So
thank you, everybody.
With that, we'll conclude this webinar, and see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye, Mike. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all. Let's see, I'll stop share and I'll wind